Hey, what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I'm going to be reviewing A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Brigid Kemmerer. This is the first book, and I believe either a fantasy duology or trilogy. I'm not 100% sure how much that this book was going to be in terms of a series length. It's supposed to be a retelling of sorts of the Disney movie Beauty and the Beast, and unfortunately for me, I think that it fell very short in terms of the retelling aspect. So my issue with this being not so much a retelling as really just a reimagining of Beauty and the Beast is that I think it relied too heavily in the marketing aspect of it being a retelling as opposed to it being a real reimagining. The way that I remember this book being marketed when it was first, getting ready to come out was that it was going to be a whole retelling of Beauty and the Beast, but our Belle was going to have a physical disability, more specifically cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is basically when a baby is born, something happens while they are being born that causes them to have serious mental and physical disabilities later in life. Many times, like the way that our main character Harper is described, there are certain muscles in the body that don't work as well. So in the book, Harper is described as having a bit of a limp, where one of her legs does not have the same muscle tone and same muscle capabilities as her other leg. What I would really like to say though about this in terms of the representation is not necessarily that I found it to be incredibly accurate. I don't want to speak on that aspect of it. I do want to say though that I feel like I appreciated the way that the representation was put into the story, even though it's not something that necessarily I have, nor do I have very many people in my life that have cerebral palsy. I just really liked the way though that Brigid Kemmerer basically made this physical disability of a character not the end-all be-all of her character. If anything, the way that it was kind of done in the story is that it affects her day-to-day things like running, fighting, things of that nature, but it wasn't so much that she was a victim to her own disability, if that makes sense. Harper as a character is incredibly strong-headed and very strong-willed at the same time, and that has nothing to do with the fact that she's trying to overcompensate for the fact that she has a little bit more of a lame leg, if you will. She doesn't let that kind of stop her, and no matter how much it might hinder her in a lot of ways, Harper has never really in the book showed me that she lets it be a hindrance. She actually, if anything, tries to still do everything she possibly can, accounting for the fact that she might not be able to do some things because she can't run, for instance, very fast as well as the other people in the story. However, like I said, this disability doesn't become the end-all be-all of her character. She's so much more multifaceted than that, and it's almost as if like you could have read this story and not known she had cerebral palsy and still enjoy her as a character. It just so happens that she had this disability and it did affect some of her day-to-day life, but not to the point where it was distracting, not to the point where it made it seem like that was all her character was her disability. From a reader standpoint, understanding that representation is incredibly important and should be done in the way that, advocates for a specific group of people and should, let people with that certain marginalized identity or disability know that they are valued, things of that nature. I found it to be incredibly heartwarming to see something like that, where this disability did not necessarily hinder the character so much that they no longer had this multifaceted personality, nor were they not able to be an actual human being with a disability. It's kind of one of those things where, like, in writing, when you make a character that has these kind of issues, there should be the character with something as the character that has something. I feel like there's a very different tonal shift when you describe a character that has this disability and then you have a character with a disability. It's almost like one of those things where the phrasing of a character with a disability makes it known that they have it, but it doesn't directly affect a lot of the story itself. It only affects certain things about how they live their life day to day, whereas the phrasing of a character that has a disability almost makes it seem like it is the end-all be-all of their character. There's nothing else to them. That is just it, which is not the case. Any person that has a physical, mental, emotional disability or is from a certain marginalized community, that's not all that their personality is. There's so many aspects to their personality that the stories should focus on. And I really appreciate how this book in particular showcased a character with a disability as opposed to a character that has a disability. However, despite that really amazing representation that I thought was really interesting to look at in terms of an aspect of a story, the story fell flat in a lot of ways for me. The biggest issue I have is that, like I said, the marketing aspect of the fact that it was a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, I think was not the way this should have gone, because it kind of puts this idea in the reader's head that it's going to be like a carbon copy story of the story that it's supposedly a retelling of. One of the other examples I have of this is Cinder by Marissa Meyer. Now, Cinder was not necessarily a retelling, but it was a reimagining of the character Cinderella in a completely different world from a different part of the world. As opposed to being in Europe, it was placed in more of a China-based area. And the story itself, while it had some elements that reminded you of the Disney story of Cinderella, the whole story of Cinder was completely different. There were so many aspects to the world that changed the entire story, but was able to pull on some elements and some kinds of characters that reminded you of the story of Cinderella, but not so much that it was an exact carbon copy. I feel like this was the way that the story was intending to go, and I think that the way it was marketed made it seem like though it was supposed to be a straight up carbon copy of Beauty and the Beast. More than anything else, it's a reimagining, because there are some scenes you could be able to pick out from the Beauty and the Beast cartoon that was done by Disney. I was able to find various scenes that reminded me of that stuff. Certain elements in the story reminded me of elements within the Disney cartoon. For instance, Harper, she ends up having a cell phone that she takes over with her into Emberfall, but it doesn't really work, but it does give her almost like a mirror back to the real world where she's from, because she's able to look through text messages and pictures that are on it. So in a sense, that is kind of her mirror of sorts, where she's able to look back at her family, but it doesn't give her the real world, like how they're doing kind of thing. It's kind of more of like just a mirror back in time. So I've been sitting here for like 8 minutes now and haven't even really told you what the whole point of the story is, because it's like I said, it's supposed to be a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, but I'll get into the actual synopsis of it. So Curse of Dark and Lonely follows two main characters. We have Harper, who is essentially our Belle character, who is whisked away to Emberfall, where we have our other character, Ren, who is the Crown Prince of Emberfall. All we know really about him is that he has basically been subjected to this curse where he every season has to try and have somebody fall in love with him and have that love return to them so that the curse will be broken. But unfortunately, by the end of every season, if he does not get that person to fall in love with him and fall in love with them back, he turns into a dangerous monster that is out for blood, and he has no memory of what happens while he is the monster. He just knows that this monster that he becomes goes off and kills several people, which include his own kingdom. There's a lot of backstory that plays into the story that you learn further on as to who exactly he's killed, why he is really the only one left in his kingdom, or at least at the castle, and what exactly is happening to the kingdom surrounding the castle, because that has a huge impact. The way that things happen at the castle have a huge impact on what is happening in the actual kingdom itself. And there are other things happening, like there is a neighboring kingdom who is looking to take over Emberfall, and Ren has to figure out how exactly to handle that while keeping the secret, and also now trying to figure out what to do with Harper, because Harper is very much dead set against never wanting to fall in love with him, because she knows that she was basically kidnapped by his commander, Gray. One of the things that I really disliked about this is that it wasn't until the absolute very end of the book that we had gotten a perspective from Gray, who is the commander of the Royal Guard. He is literally the only person left in the castle beside Ren and Harper. And I hated the fact that we didn't get any perspective of him until the very end of the book, because I know he had so much to say. The interactions that he had with Harper and with Ren and respectively, like they could have so easily been chapters that had Gray's perspective entirely on it, and I wanted to know what he thought about certain things. I feel like the story really faltered with not having Gray as a full-on perspective, because it just would have made so much more sense to have this kind of story where we have three perspectives from some of the most important characters. And Gray has so many different layers to him that I wanted to dig into those layers. And I think that though is one of the things that comes in the second book, A Heart So Fierce and Broken. So I am interested in reading the second book, despite how low I think I rated this, because I want to know more about what happens to Gray. And I think we get his perspective in that book, so I want to know about what his thoughts are of a lot of things that have happened in the first book and then how things are happening for him in the second book. The other thing I hated that I feel like goes back to this idea of it being a reimagining as opposed to a retelling is that the reimagining portion was a far cry from what Beauty and the Beast really was. This had a lot of the elements that Beauty and the Beast originally had, but it was so far removed from the actual story of Beauty and the Beast the cartoon that I feel like it should have been marketed as a reimagining like Cinder was, as opposed to a retelling like the way it was. I feel like there's so many things about it that get explored that never would have been thought of when it came to Beauty and the Beast at all, that this should have been its own story as opposed to being marketed as almost like a carbon copy. I think I wasn't so much disappointed in that as I wish that it just wasn't marketed the way that it was, because I feel like I got such a way different experience from it than I would have had it been a almost carbon copy of the story of Beauty and the Beast. Another thing I really disliked about this was I think the writing style in general, because the chapters of Ren's perspective, I thought the writing style was pretty cool. I liked it. It was very, you know, hoity-toity prince kind of language, if you will, especially fantasy language, like your very eloquent, elegant writing, flowery, all of those things. But then when it came to Harper's perspectives, I felt like the writing style was trying so hard not to be like Ren's that it was like Ren. Like, it was the most bizarre thing I think I ever experienced, is that you have two characters who are very, very different, and yet their writing styles are the exact same almost. The next thing I want to talk about is the political intrigue. Like I just said, the political intrigue of a neighboring kingdom coming in and taking over Emberfall was absolutely amazing. I loved that aspect. I am such a sucker for political intrigue when it comes to fantasy stories. It is like my bread and butter. It is one of the things I love the most because I love conflict like that, and I love seeing the issues that these neighboring kingdoms have. We don't know necessarily everything there is to know about what exactly happens between these two kingdoms, but all that we do get to understand is that one of the neighboring kingdoms feels that because the kingdom of Emberfall kind of has fallen in a sense, that this other kingdom feels like it's just, you know, it needs to take over and get everything in order, because even though Ren is still around, the Queen of Shilsalo, the neighboring kingdom, does not believe he is capable of handling this entire kingdom, and she just wants to take it over for herself. There are some other interesting elements involved with that in terms of like the Enchantress character that I don't want to go too much into, but she has a huge role in what exactly is happening with all of that I think added a very interesting layer to the Enchantress character herself and what the capabilities of her could have been if Beauty and the Beast had taken more of a political intrigue-ness kind of story. But the cartoon was meant for kids, so it couldn't really go into that, but that's why I like this so much as a reimagining, is because this literally takes the story of Beauty and the Beast and turns it into something completely different, and I love that aspect, but I just wish that the marketing of it had not set my expectations up for it to be a carbon copy of this, because I think that led me to be disappointed, but then looking back on it in a lot of ways, it does actually work really well for the story. I just don't like the way that it was marketed, because I had my expectations set for one thing and it ended up being something completely different that I was so caught off guard by that I didn't know how to feel. But now, having been away from it for a couple of days, I'm like, this is the way that I think I would have wanted it to be, but it should have been handled in a very different way. So overall, I think that in general I liked it, but I had some kind of major issues with the way the story had gone in terms of the writing style, and I really feel like the story was way worse without Gray's perspective. I think if Gray had a perspective within the story and not at the very end as an epilogue, this story would have been so much more rich. But the book already was over 500 pages, so I do understand if the publishing company had said, you know, maybe we should get rid of Gray's perspective because it's not as important as like Ren and Harper, who are really the main characters of the story. So I understand from that point of view, because I do know that publishing tends to cut out stuff because they only have so much money that they can spend with a certain book, and that includes the printing of pages. They only are able to print so many pages of a book because it costs so much money to go and print those. So I get that, but I feel like the story really faltered without Grace's perspective, because I think he would have just added so much more complexity to the story, because there's not necessarily a love triangle, but there are like feelings between Gray and Harper that develop that I wish I would have known more about from Gray's side of things. So I don't know. I liked it. I liked it enough to where I want to read the second book at the very least. So I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, but it was okay. It was really good, I think, for what it was. I just don't think it's my absolute favorite book in the world, but it is something where my interest is piqued so much that I really want to get a Heart So Fierce and Broken, because the way that things ended, especially with Grace's perspective, I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions that I feel like could have been answered in the first book, but they weren't, and now I need to get the second book so I can get those questions answered. So there you guys go. That is my review of A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Brigid Kemmerer. Let me know what your guys' thoughts were on this, especially if you are own voices and would like to comment on the cerebral palsy rep that was involved in the story. Thank you all so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!